Welcome back to the channel. I want to talk about a new endeavor I have going. It's called the Drug Development Letter. It's a letter for people interested in cancer drug and other drug development, particularly cardiovascular and Alzheimer's drugs. It's at developdrugs.substack.com. And if you like Plenary Session Podcast, if you like these sorts of critical appraisals of clinical trials, drug development articles, you're going to like that website. It's going to try to have articles that are broadly accessible, but also some for the more technical readers. And in that respect, it'll be different than Sensible Medicine and Vinay Prasad's observations and thoughts, because it's going to go into the weeds. We're going to cover everything that's phase 3 drug registration, phase 4. We're going to cover pivotal phase 2s. We may even get into early drug development and preclinical models. We're going to get into that probably around the conferences, but it's going to be the go-to source. Cancer drugs will be most of it, but it will probably expand into cardiology and some other spaces. I recently posted, I think, a few of the inaugural posts. We've got a good one coming up on sotorasib. We're going to try to cover a lot of the research that comes out of my laboratory, and I recently interviewed Aaron Goodman for that, and you should check it out. This is going to be a video and an audio, if you're listening on the plenary session feed, about randomized control trials, sort of 101, some basics to it. Just going to be short and sweet. I was recently down in San Diego, and Aaron asked me to explain Kaplan-Meier. I did, and it got such a warm response. I was surprised. It was just 15 minutes right off the top of my head, but people really liked sort of some simple explanations of this stuff. So I figured that's what you're going to get today. And I'm also going to put this on the plenary session audio feed for those of you listening at home. So, randomized control trials. Of course, randomization is a beautiful way to test things that offer putative benefits with modest to marginal effect sizes. If something has a parachute effect size, well, you don't need randomization to know if that works. You can see it by the naked eye. So if something improves survival from 0% near total fatality, like falling out of an airplane from 10,000 feet, to 99.999997% survival rate, like a parachute, it ain't 100, but it's pretty close. You don't need really much statistical test to know that it has a huge benefit. We're talking about most things in biomedicine with modest to marginal effect sizes, which is really most of what we do. Randomization, of course, you take a lot of people, you randomize them to one group or the other. One group gets some experimental intervention, the other group gets the best available care. Sometimes that's placebo, sometimes that's best available care plus a placebo, but what they shouldn't be getting is deprived of best available care. I'm sure we're going to cover that at some point. We've already covered it on this channel, we're going to cover it more. And we follow them in time. And the beauty of this is that in the absence of a therapeutic effect, what you've done is you've equilibrated outcome distributions. The outcome you care about should be broadly the same distribution in both groups unless there is a therapeutic effect. Now, some people say that you eliminate you eliminate all confounding, you make it perfectly balanced. The idea that you make it perfectly balanced is not technically true. It's the idea that the outcome distribution is equilibrated and some particular indices may be slightly different, but you know they're different by chance alone, and very likely they're balanced by other differences that go the other direction. Now, why do we like randomized control trials? They have 3 virtues over what is increasingly popular observational studies used to make conclusions about causal efficacy of products. The 3 virtues that randomization has, of course, is number 1. It controls for unmeasured confounding. Of course, you balance the variables you are aware of as confounders, but you also balance those other variables as well. And observational studies just don't do that. You know, you could say, let's compare people who rushed to get the bivalent booster to those who didn't. Well, of course, there's one difference, that some people got the booster and some people didn't, but there are other differences as well, such as some people are the type of person is going to rush to get the bivalent booster. That's a unique type of person. They may be precautious in other ways. And so any differences between these two groups may be in part due to the intervention, but also in part due to the fact that they're different people. And that's the problem that plagues observational studies, unmeasured confounding. You don't know what you don't measure. Often we do a piss-poor job of measuring socioeconomic factors, measuring behavioral factors. We barely have a grasp of that. People use very crude adjustments for income. They're not really getting at who is really living rich and privileged lives and who are not. And so, that's a great pitfall of observational research. We control for that in randomization because we equilibrate the outcomes distribution in the absence of a therapeutic effect. The second thing we do is we anchor time 0. We make sure that everyone starts at the exact same time. Observational studies are always backwards looking, or often backwards looking. And when they're backwards looking, even when they're forwards looking, because you may not start somebody off at exactly the same time. Now, what do I mean by that? If you want to study people who were hospitalized with a heart attack and compare those who were prescribed metformin to those who were not prescribed metformin, you probably would find that those who are prescribed metformin or maybe a statin or some other medication like that have better outcomes than those who were not prescribed those medications. Will you conclude that those medications are potentially life-saving? It's possible they are, but the other bias is that there's something unique about the people who had those prescriptions placed. They lived long enough to have somebody have an opportunity to place that prescription. They lived long enough through the acute myocardial infarction when people are panicking, when they're calling in the cath lab. They lived long enough till day 2 or day 3 where somebody could put them on metformin. Whereas somebody who comes in with an acute MI and they code immediately and then they die, they could not have ever had somebody place that prescription for metformin. So the time until you get metformin in a retrospective observational study looking at its efficacy post-MI is guaranteed to one group, you see? It's guaranteed to them because to define them, you define them as those who got it. But it's not guaranteed to the other group. And the time until it occurs is the guarantee time or immortal time. It's time that you couldn't have died because if you died, you couldn't be the group who got metformin. And this is a deep problem that plagues observational research, is that we don't exactly know the time zero. But randomization is beautiful because they're coming in and they're being randomized, and we're anchoring time zero at the moment of randomization. Second virtue. The third virtue, of course, is multiplicity or multiple hypothesis testing. If you take an observational data set like the NHANES data set, which is a food frequency questionnaire, you can link it to long-term survival outcomes. And what you find is that for popular questions like green tea or dark chocolate, it's very likely that 10,000 or 100,000 different investigators have probed that relationship, asking, is more or less blueberries or more or less chocolate associated with long-term beneficial outcomes like living longer, living better? How many times have they run the analysis? Thousands of times, tens of thousands of times? How many times do they publish the analysis? Not every time they run it. Maybe they get a null estimate. Maybe they get something that's unimpressive. How many different ways can you run the analysis? And the answer is hundreds of thousands or millions or even tens of millions of ways. You can adjust for age or sex and pre-existing cardiovascular disease, or age, sex, race, socioeconomics, smoking, and pre-existing cardiovascular disease or not. Famously, John Ioannidis, Chirag Patel, and Belinda Buford simulated taking a single observational data set and running simple questions, vitamin D and mortality, vitamin E and mortality, with all of the possible combinations that occur when you adjust for the 13 most popular adjustments. And what they found was that for many of these substances, maybe 40% of things we eat, you can get statistically significant favorable and unfavorable conclusions merely by picking and choosing different covariates. So what's my point about multiplicity? Why is this the third limit of observational research? When you run a randomized trial, you write in stone what you're going to do. You set out to do it. There are not that many people doing it. For instance, when it comes to like masking and COVID-19, we have 3 major randomized efforts in the community across the whole pandemic. But when you do an observational study of masking during COVID-19, there may be thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of analytic plans that are being run. And they're all being filtered with many different, they're all being filtered through the lenses of the people who run those plans. And the person who gets the result they may not like, may not show the boss, and the boss who gets a result that they think is implausible, too good to be true, or that is pessimistic, they may not publish that. And then the entire publishing enterprise picks and chooses what is the end product, what we see from this huge process of analysis. So, why is randomization a virtue? It's not a virtue for every question, but for interventions that offer a purported benefit with a modest to marginal effect size. Not for parachutes, but for most of the things we do in biomedicine, because most of what we do in biomedicine has a modest to marginal effect size. They nicely solve 3 problems. 1, they balance outcomes distributions in the absence of therapeutic effect, so they correct for that unmeasured confounding. 2, they anchor time zero, so you don't have immortal time. You don't have that sort of bias. And number 3, they actually correct for multiplicity, because you just can't run 100,000 of them. Maybe in a future video or elsewhere, I'll talk about multiplicity that is being introduced in oncology, because for the rare, in this moment, we're actually, for a few drugs, we are actually running so many randomized trials that you start to have to think about the whole universe of studies before you interpret any one. All right, so that's the randomized trial. It was originally developed in, I think most people believe it was in the 1940s, that streptozocin and the Medical Research Council of the UK was the first RCT. The point I recently made on a Sensible Medicine post was, it's really interesting that the first randomized controlled trial was in the 20th century. The ancient Greeks didn't think about it. The Egyptians didn't think about it. It took to the 20th century. And I think and even to this day, I think there are many people who haven't fully embraced it. There are people who said you couldn't do randomized trials of non-pharmacologic interventions during the pandemic. Those people were just totally wrong. Now they see that the Cochrane Review is astonishingly negative. They want to say we should have done those studies, and had we done them, they would have been positive, of course. That's their worldview. I think it is very psychologically difficult for human beings to believe in their heart that randomization is the best way to answer a question. We are mechanistic thinkers. We like to see the chain of events. We like to have faith in mechanisms. We like to rationalize and tell stories. We are reductionist scientists. We have difficulty thinking about emergent phenomenon, emergent behaviors. We have difficulty thinking about randomness. We're not comfortable letting ourselves and our faiths be determined by randomization. And as such, the Greeks didn't develop it. It wasn't developed to the 20th century. But to be fair, they could have easily developed it because the ancient Greeks could easily have randomized fields to different crop strategies and figured out what works. They had all the tools at their disposal. They just didn't think of it. It is the greatest medical intervention of the 20th century, and it could be the greatest invention of the 21st century if we were to really embrace it and use randomization more and more, earlier, and more thoughtfully than what we do. All right, so that's just on randomized controlled trials. Let's just talk briefly about 1-to-1, 2-to-1 randomization. This is something that somebody asked me from NYU. 1-to-1 randomization is optimized for a particular question you're asking. You want to know if a new treatment is better than an older treatment. You want to have the fewest number of people to detect a difference of X, whatever that difference is. The 1-to-1 randomization is going to be able to do that with the fewest number of participants. It is the optimal way to answer, does this treatment improve survival by 10 percentage points at year 2? And let's say it'll take, 100 people to answer that in a 1-to-1 randomization, 50 per arm, or 200 people, 100 per arm. If you start to go to 2-to-1 randomization or 3-to-1 randomization, it is to some degree suboptimal. You need more total participants. 2-to-1, I think typically it's 12% more. 3-to-1, it's 33% more participants. But because it's a skewed randomization, 2-to-1, you can put twice as many people on what you think is the arm you're excited about, the intervention arm, and you can put you can put fewer people on the arm you think is the bad arm. It actually works out to be the case that 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 typically randomize fewer people to the control intervention than 1-to-1 randomization. Now, all this assumes that the intervention actually offers something of value. All right, I have to adjust this. Useless microphone stands. All this assumes the intervention offers something of value. And if you have a very favorable view of your intervention, you might want to do 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. But of course, it isn't always the case. Many interventions fail, in which case, sadly, you've utilized more participants, and actually you may have even assigned more to the harmful or useless or futile strategy. The last thing I'll say about this, we have studied one purported explanation for 2-to-1, 3-to-1, which is that it is an enticement factor. People are more likely to accrue on your study if you offer 2-to-1 because it's a new sexy drug. I want 2 out of 3 chance of getting that drug. I don't want just 1 out of 2 chance of getting that drug. Right, Doc? Well, Christina Janai and I studied it, I think in a BMC cancer paper, where we have shown predictors of accrual in studies. And when you adjust for other known variables, what you find is that it don't make a lick of difference. They don't accrue even 1 moment sooner with 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. And if what you're recommending is mediocre, tends not to work, or is harmful, you are squandering patients and using up a resource. So I'm generally a critic of that because I think in oncology, ironically, that a lot of what we do is bogus. Even our clinical trials that are quote-unquote positive are not really positive because we're not improving overall survival and health-related quality of life. And as such, I tend to prefer a 1-to-1 randomization. I guess we can talk about adaptive randomization briefly. There are some randomized clinical trials that the strategy is actually to adjust the ratio of randomization as the initial results come in. So the arm that starts to look more favorable, we're going to start to weight randomization to that arm and have more people accrue on that arm. Well, the problem with this is actually nicely argued by some NCI statisticians, where they point out that one arm that gets an initial lead is going to start to get more people randomized to that arm. And then people randomized to that arm, one difference, than the initial people is that they live in the future. They're either 6 months in the future or 8 months in the future. So if there's a secular trend in that space for getting better at supportive care or palliative care or better hospitalization care or better at managing the adverse events or better at managing adverse events of the disease in general, that's going to also benefit the intervention arm. So now you have two variables. It's a randomized study, and presumably the only difference between the two groups in terms of outcome is the therapeutic effect. But now you're also adding in a temporal effect. Any secular trend will actually benefit the arm that starts to get more randomization. So an early imbalance, even due to chance, can be reinforced by a secular trend, and something that actually doesn't work so well is going to look favorable. Okay, that's a very technical point, but it's something to be aware of, that there is a debate about whether or not adjusting the randomization ratio over time. Obviously, even for 2-to-1 and these debates, the gold standard way to settle the debate is empirical data rather than sort of an argument about what ought to happen based on the principles of randomization, but empirical data is often lacking, as in this case. All right, let's talk about blinding and concealment. Concealment means at the moment of randomization, the person enrolling on the study doesn't know which arm they're going to be in. It's really important. In the old days, some of the doctors would even hold the envelope up to the light and look and use that to thwart randomization. And if the person knows which arm they're being randomized to, it can create imbalances and big problems. One example is the Bangladesh cluster randomized controlled trial of masking, where there are a lot more people who signed up in villages that were getting a free mask than those that were not getting a free mask. More than by chance alone. How do you explain it? Well, one potential explanation, and even the authors suggest might be true, is that people in the mask villages, they might have a sense they're getting a freebie. And the people in the no-mask villages might know they're not getting a freebie. Why? Because when the investigators pull up to consent them on the trial, they're either pulling up in a Toyota Yaris or a big truck with boxes in the back, okay? That's a concealment issue. You didn't conceal randomization from the subjects, and so there's an imbalance in randomization, and it creates big problems, which is randomization assumes an equal outcome distribution in the absence of an effect. But now you have one extra person for every 10 people or 20 people in one arm. You have an extra person in one arm rather than the other. Does that person have the equal outcome distribution, or are they different in some way? In Bangladesh, part of the trial requires you to phone up the number when you have symptoms to let them know so they can test you for COVID. Do you think that 11th person, that person who signed up in a mask village because they saw the possibility of a freebie, who didn't sign up in the no mask village because it was a smaller car, so they suspected they weren't getting anything for free, do you think that person, the kind of person who only signs up for a randomized study, if you feel like you're going to get something that moment, do you think that person is just as likely to dial that number as the people who would sign up for sort of more altruistic reasons? And I think it's a legitimate question that they would not be. And that imbalance could thwart the whole study design. So that's concealment. Blinding. Blinding, of course, means that once you're on the study, are you aware of which treatment you're being assigned to? And it's true for both the patients. It's also true for the doctors. So you can have a double-blind study. It can even be triple-blind. The statistician and the analytic team can be blinded to it. Or the follow-up can be blinded to it. And I think we generally believe that blinding, it plays a huge value in studies where the primary endpoint is subjective. It's how you feel. It's how you function. It's how much pain you have. It's how much angina you have. In those cases, you really want blinding because you want to separate the treatment effect from the placebo effect. To my knowledge, the placebo effect has not resulted in people living longer lives, so one might argue it would be less necessary if overall mortality was the endpoint. But because blinding can affect subsequent treatments, you may argue in individual instances that it ought to be blinded so that the doctors don't treat people outside of the trial differently, so that it isn't the intervention you're isolating the effect of, but rather some other treatment that is a consequence of the intervention. And if you really want to get into the weeds on this, you can read some of the papers we've written about sham controls and blinding that Jenny Gill and I have published, where we talk about methods that you could ensure the quality of the sham and separate sort of a placebo intervention from the possibility that people will feel like they're getting a placebo. Let me expand on that. When you do a medical procedure for something like pain, like osteoarthritis of the knee, and you're doing a joint washout or debridement, you can randomize people to the arthroscope going in the knee or the arthroscope going in the knee and doing the debridement. So a sham procedure, we would say we did it or we did it. But are those procedures going to be equally long? Is there going to be something about the doctor's demeanor that tips the patient off that maybe I'm in the placebo group? And the answer is we have a method where we can try to look for that and separate that from the actual effect, from the placebo effect, and from you sniffing out that you're not actually getting the treatment. All right. The last thing I'll conclude about is the Kaplan-Meier plot. So once you run a randomized controlled trial, you can use all sorts of endpoints. The most common endpoint we use in randomized controlled trials, at least in oncology, is a time to event endpoint. It's the time until something happens. By definition, it couldn't have happened at time 0, and so that's why we always start at 0% or 100%. The time to event endpoint that most people are intuitively familiar with is overall survival, the time until you die, shown over time. There are other composite time to event endpoints that we love. PFS, DFS, TTP. PFS is progression-free survival. It's the time until you have progression or die, whichever comes first. And progression is defined as a 20% growth in tumor dimensions from the nadir value, the smallest it ever was. That means if your tumors never shrink, when they're 20% bigger, you progress. If they do shrink from the smallest they get, when you get 20% bigger than that, you progress. Also, new lesions on a scan, that's often resist progression. And then death is the fourth component. TTP, or time to progression, is a lot like PFS, except death isn't scored as an event. It's something you censor someone for. So you look for progression among those who haven't died, and if they die, you'll look for progression in the people who remain. Of course, that has a big problem with the endpoint, which is that a drug that kills a lot of people might have a great TTP if it kills off the sickest patients, but it's not a good drug to take, and so that's why we move from TTP to PFS. DFS or RFS, relapse-free survival, disease-free survival, they often vary by tumor type. You know, in something like breast oncology, a DFS event could be the time to a cancer recurrence. Well, let me point out one thing. They're typically also used in the adjuvant setting. DFS in breast could be the time to cancer recurrence in that breast, in the other breast, DCIS in that breast, in the other breast, a distant recurrence like in the spine or death, and the composite of all those things, whichever comes first, is a DFS event. That's like something in breast. IDFS is invasive disease-free survival, where we subtract the DCIS. You get in the weeds with these composite time to event endpoints. They're not all equivalent to patients. Patients don't view them all the same. Of course, it's a lot worse to die than to have a local breast cancer recurrence after breast cancer surgery, and it's a lot worse to have a spinal recurrence than it is to have a local DCIS, so they're not all equivalent. And in cancer, these composite endpoints have some correlation with overall survival. It varies by tumor type and setting, and you can read papers that I've done, papers with Allison Haslam, to find that. The Kaplan-Meier method, you know, it's a clever method to keep track of a time to event endpoint. It acknowledges the fact that not all the patients who enroll in a randomized study come to you on day one. 500 people here to be randomized. No, it's not like that. Maybe 20 will come in the first month to be randomized, 25 the next month, 25 the next month, 25 the next month, until finally you have 500. And then, let's say you started your trial in 2017. 2020 comes by and you're ready to analyze the data. You've accrued 500 people by maybe 2019, and you get 200 events. That was the first time you're going to look at the data. So you want to look at the data, but you realize that the people who enrolled in 2019, you may only have a year of follow-up on those people. The people who enrolled in 2017, you've got 3 years of follow-up. So what do you do with the survival curve for somebody who enrolled a year ago when we start to look at 14 months or 16 months or 18 months? And the Kaplan-Meier method is simple. It's very clever. It says we're going to take everybody's information, and everybody, we know what happened to them in week 1, so we're going to use the survival outcomes of everybody in week 1. Week 2, everybody who didn't have an event. Week 3, so on and so on. And when you get to the point where you start to lose people because they only enrolled 3 months ago or 2 months ago or 1 year ago, you extrapolate the outcomes for people who you know their fate to the people who you don't know their fate. You make the estimate, the Kaplan-Meier estimate, that the guy who enrolled in 2019, he's no healthier, wealthier, or wise than the person who enrolled in 2017, so it would be reasonable to assume his survival probabilities in year 2 and 3 would be similar to what that 2017 person experienced. And that is the beauty of the method. It's a maximum information harvesting method. It maximally collects information from participants, and it uses all of that information to create a projection of what the survival function would be over time. And the moment you lose follow-up for somebody for whatever reason, it no longer includes their data and assumes that they do just as well as someone in whom we have data. And this assumption is called uninformative censoring, that the censored person, the person who we lose track of, or that we don't have enough information on, is no different than the person in whom we do. And that by censoring them, it's uninformative. It doesn't change the survival estimate. But of course, as I talk about with Aaron Goodman, there are many times where that assumption might not be true. You might have a randomized control trial of a new drug versus placebo, like sotorasib versus placebo, and you'll have 16% of people drop out on the docetaxel arm. Sotorasib versus docetaxel, and you'll have 16% of people drop out on docetaxel because they don't want to be on that arm. And now you got a big problem, which is that is the survival function of the people who didn't drop out the same as those who do drop out? The whole purpose of a randomization was to equilibrate the outcome distribution in the absence of a therapeutic effect. But is that still true when it's only 84% of people sticking with one arm and 100% the other arm? Is that true? Or conversely, as with exemestane everolimus, you got more people dropping out on the treatment arm. What's going on here? Is it possible the experimental drug is so toxic it's making people throw in the towel? And then the moment they drop out, they no longer participate in the composite time to event endpoint, PFS. You got to get scanned to be eligible for PFS. And so now you start to have imbalances that are not due to therapeutic effect and not due to randomization per se. Differences in dropouts, differences in attrition. And the Kaplan-Meier method keeps assuming that those people who stop showing to scan are otherwise the same and would have had the same survival function. But I have a theory that the people who quit the control arm, that's docetaxel, because they could do better off, they're probably more socioeconomically connected. They probably have more resources than those people who just had nothing, no better option. They had to take docetaxel. And I have a theory that that person who threw in the towel on everolimus exemestane might be a little sicker, older, or more vulnerable than the person who kept swallowing those pills. And so those imbalances might drive the endpoint rather than the therapeutic effect. And this is called censoring. We've written a lot of papers on this topic, including some with Usama Bilal, Kate Rosen. You can pull them up. All right. I think that's the gist of it. I mean, that's the gist of what I wanted to get across in a introductory. What are we doing here? 25 minutes. Gosh, longer than I thought. Yeah, that's the gist of the introduction to randomized controlled trials. Why are they so useful? They're useful because in a world of hype and unbridled optimism and marketing and profiteering, they alone can separate real effects from pseudo effects, from things that are just in your head. And they work really well for things that you think have a putative benefit, that you think have a modest to marginal effect size, which, by the way, is most of biomedicine. Most of biomedicine are things we think we help people by. Most of public health is things we think we're helping people, and they mostly have a modest to marginal effect size. Only an idiot would think that our interventions are all parachutes. Only an idiot would use the parachute analogy because there's nothing in biomedicine that has that sort of light switch effect. And in fact, many, many empirical studies have documented that very few things, actually nothing that I'm aware of in biomedicine, has that effect. The largest one I'm aware of is ECMO for neonates in respiratory distress. And we're talking about a 40% absolute risk reduction over 30 days, whereas a parachute has a 99.999% absolute risk reduction over 10 minutes. Nothing like that. We don't do anything quite like that in biomedicine. Maybe tying off, if you sever your arm, putting a tourniquet on. But I think even that might not have that high, and it might even, probably a little bit lower than that because of maybe some spontaneous vasospasm saves a few people, and some people are not going to be saved anyway. It's not going to have that kind of, I mean, there's really nothing. I can't even think of anything with a 99.999%. Okay. Most of what we do is modest to marginal effect size. The Impella, at best, modest to marginal. Bone marrow transplant, at best, modest to marginal. Let's be real. Everything you do in oncology, modest to marginal effect size. Let's be real. And if you have something like that, the only way to separate a real therapeutic effect from the fact that you think it might be helpful is randomization. And why? Because randomization solves the three big problems that observational research is plagued by. 1, unmeasured confounding. 2, time zero. And 3, limiting multiplicity. Because limiting the number of times you get to run your analytical plan and cherry pick the best is a huge boon in a world of people who are incentivized to claim discovery, because that's what doctors and scientists are. We're heavily incentivized to claim we thought of something clever and new. Then, once you have decided upon randomization, you need to know something about randomization ratios. I think 1-to-1 is an optimal 2 to 1 has some advantages. Fewer people get the 1, but more people are needed for the whole thing. And so if you're only shooting winners, it's going to be good. But if you got the failure rate we got, it's not going to be good. And if you think you're enticing people, I can show you empirically that's absolutely not the case. It's not an enticement. Blinding and concealment are 2 important things. Concealment is a huge problem if you violate it as they're learning. And blinding, I think, is really important to separate the real effect of the intervention from the psychological effect that somebody's caring for you and doing something about you. And the Kaplan-Meier method is a great way to look for the time to event endpoints, composite, or the rock-solid endpoints like overall survival. And the Kaplan-Meier method is pretty clever. It's a maximal information harvesting event. It's predicated on the assumption of uninformative censoring. That assumption is often violated in recent studies. All right, that's RCTs 101. Kind of just off the top of my head, with a few, just like, what do the notes actually say? The notes just say KM. It just says KM RCTs 2 to 1. Doesn't say anything of value. All right. If you like this video, go to developdrugs.substack.com and subscribe. You can get a lot of this. We're going to get even deeper. I mean, this is just like basics 101. This is just like stuff that I'm assuming everyone would know. Side note, this is also why Twitter is really kind of a pain because, there are a lot of people participating in discussions and they do not even know Basics 101. So it's like just a total waste of your time to try to even talk to them. But this is what I'm hoping people know when they come into the drug development Substack, developdrugs.substack.com, the drug development letter. We're going to build on this. We're going to have more sort of these kind of one-on-one instructional videos. I think I'm going to do some landscape of oncology next. Then I'm going to work my way through control arms, crossover, non-inferiority design, superiority design. I'm going to work my way through multiplicity in randomized studies. How does that play a role in oncology? Work my way through surrogate endpoints, surrogate validation, and those sorts of topics. So if you're listening to this on the plenary session audio feed, it's probably going to be followed by an interview with Dr. Aaron Goodman. If you're watching this video, go check out that blog. And until next time.